Hello again. It's time for another fantastic lesson from the first 9 weeks. And I have my big picture open here. This lesson is the rhetorical analysis activity that we are going to do with an excerpt from Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at the big picture because this is such a big lesson and I want to be able to take you through as much of it as I can. We do see that we've done the text comparison. At this point, students will also have learned a lot about annotation with the general history of Virginia lesson, and they will be ready to use the skills that they learned in those and add many, many more in this big rhetorical analysis activity. I'm going to go straight into the lesson, and I've highlighted some essential information. Just like all the other lessons, we have the same format. We'll always start with teacher notes, and you have some background information about the lesson. It teaches how to deconstruct an AP style prompt. And while that's really important for the kids who are heading to AP Lang and AP Lit, it's also important for all students to be able to understand the way that arguments are put together so that they're able to eventually write their own strong argumentative essays. There's going to be practice with annotation, and we're going to start looking for some specific things in the text, patterns of negative and positive diction, imagery, figurative language, and repetition. So this is a very big, very rich lesson. You have your materials and resources, some assessment options that you can use, and of course the suggestions for how to work through each activity. If you have not already watched the rhetorical triangle video, I really encourage you to go back and watch that before you move forward with this lesson, because it's so very important to understand the way that the rhetorical triangle works, so that you're able to teach that to your students and make sure they have a really firm understanding of that before they move forward through this work. Getting down into the actual activities. So the first activity is a prompt debrief and some pre-reading questions. We want to let the students read this prompt, and we want to make sure that they understand what the task is that they're being asked to do, and we want them to be able to find any information in the prompt that can help them to achieve the task. And so question number 1, what task does the prompt ask you to do? We want to show them how to find those verbs that give them their task. In this case, the task is to analyze a rhetorical strategy. So we would want to encourage them to find that verb, and that's going to lead them to their task. The background information in the prompt, we would hope they would hone in on the time period. 18th century minister is the speaker here. It was delivered in 1741 to a congregation in Connecticut. From the prompt, what is revealed about Edwards's audience? We would hope that they would pick up on the fact that this audience is a congregation, a group of people attending church, and all that implies. And then finally, what does the prompt identify as Edwards's 2 purposes? Those are pretty easy to spot there at the end. He is condemning his congregation and providing a pathway to salvation. So take the time to work through that prompt with students and give them as many strategies as you can to mine that prompt and get as much information from it as they can. Then we move into the rhetorical triangle. And if you've already watched the video, I hope you have a pretty sound understanding of how that works. And so you'll guide students through the points on the triangle with just the information that they were able to get from the prompt. They still have not read any of the passage yet. And so they would know that the speaker is Jonathan Edwards. They would know that his audience is his congregation, and his message or purpose, they could just go right back up to these 2 the two purposes that they identified: condemning his congregation, providing that pathway to salvation, and then spend some time talking about the relationships that exist among these 3 points. What does Edwards know about his congregation? He probably knows that they are faithful believers and that they are afraid of the consequences of living immoral lifestyles. The audience, in turn, knows that Edwards is their pastor. They probably trust him and believe him, and they're probably very fearful of the message that he is delivering. He is probably well aware of that and using really strong language to activate those fears so that he can get them to change. So it's very, very important to really work through this rhetorical triangle with students and do everything you can to help them understand this part before you move deeper into the lesson. And then there are some questions down below that can help with that can help guide students through connecting those points on the triangle. And then they're going to read the excerpt from the sermon. I have that pulled up here. And while it's not the whole sermon, it's still a good bit of text. So you might want to consider reading at least some of this aloud with students and then maybe chunking the rest of it to make it more manageable for them. You can choose kind of how you want to do that. As they read, they're asked to annotate 4 specific items: negative and positive diction, imagery, and figurative language, and repetition. And so the best way to do this is to kind of scaffold it for them. So maybe go through and look for at least one of these things for each chart to kind of help students begin to fill this information in. So for example, the first thing that they're asked to find is an image, and then they need to explain how this evidence is persuasive to Edwards's audience. So if we go to the text, it's pretty easy to find images in this one. If you're not familiar with this sermon, it's very, very rich in imagery. So just looking in the first paragraph, it says, maybe right here, the devil is waiting for them, hell is gaping for them. That's a pretty strong image. So maybe we could point that out to students and then come back to the lesson and guide them through plugging that in. Show them how to put that quote in and how to cite it in MLA format, and then guide them through writing the commentary, because it's so important for students to be able to explain how the evidence is persuasive instead of just summarizing what it says. Then you could do the same thing maybe down here with a pattern of negative diction. Again, that's pretty easy to find in this sermon. If we still look in the first paragraph, we can see, let's see, provoked, anger, right? Suffering. Those are all pretty negative words. And we could come back here and provide that example for them and discuss the way to provide some commentary. So that's kind of how you would guide through activity 2. Activity 3 is all about syntax, and that can be a harder subject for students because they might not be as familiar with it. So again, guiding them through this activity, working through some of it together. In fact, with activity 3, I would probably recommend doing this one as a whole group. They're going to need the structure, and they're going to need you to model this activity for them. Activity 4 is tone activity. We do have a resource available for that. I'm going to pull that up for you. This is a tone and mood resource that's available in your materials, And this is something that I usually give my students to put and keep in their notebook for my class, because we refer back to this a lot. But there's a lot of information about tone and mood and how to determine the difference between the two. And then there's a tone vocabulary. So we have some different tones we want to convey, and some great words that we can use to convey those feelings. And then finally, activity 5 is a post-reading reflection, and this is actually the student's first experience with timed writing. So we'll perform a kind of a mini timed write, and students will take the prompt that they have already deconstructed and worked through with you, and they'll take the passage that they've already annotated, and they're going to have about 30 minutes to write a paragraph and analyze one of the rhetorical strategies that Edwards uses. And it's probably a good idea to let them use their annotations, let them use the notes that they've made as they've worked through this activity, as they begin that process of completing a timed in-class writing.